Welcome to Antidote Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
Okay, Jeremy. So we've had this Anti Defamation League. Is it a? I don't know what to call it. Is it a piece? Is it a letter? Is it like just a list, or is it just like an organized list? Is that how you describe it?
Yeah, it's a list, I guess.
Okay, a list of these figures within the both the quote alt right and also the quote alt light, and a number of prominent figures who have a lot of backing within the respective alt right and alt light. I guess real quick, maybe I should explain maybe we should explain what alt right and alt light is. These are, I think, artificial terms. Alt right is the element. And both of these factions are solidly, almost unanimously behind Donald Trump. The alt-right, I guess, is the faction within the right that is willing to actually, criticize Zionism and Jews and all that. Whereas the alt-right are the ones who are very, I guess, are unwilling to criticize, like, the Zionism and the so-called Jewish question, the JQ as people call it. So I guess that's the difference there. But they're both artificial movements, and anyways, a number of prominent individuals in both the alt-right and the alt-light were their names and background information bios were put out about them by the Anti Defamation League, and each of the individuals listed in this ADL report are all considered dangerous people that are pushing dangerous ideologies and therefore should be considered dangerous. Now, I'm not familiar with all the people on this list. There's actually a number of people whose work I'm not familiar with, but we've identified a number of the names on this list as being, and we've talked about them, like a Mike Cernovich or I think we've alluded to Baked Alaska. We've talked in depth about Richard Spencer and about Andrew Anglin and the Daily Stormer. But what this list seems to represent, from my understanding, from how I look at it, is that the list is conspicuously made up of people that are all going to be able to use this to get sympathy and positive publicity from within their camps, and it's almost like a way to promote and signal boost these people, much like how on the flip side of that, you'll have Alinda Sarsour on the left will get condemned by some of these organizations for anti-Semitism or whatnot. So, and one example that really, I think, points out what this is all about, that this is not so much an actual condemnation of people who the Anti-Defamation League and these organizations actually consider dangerous, is contrast the attention that all of these people on this list are getting for being named as subversives and as dangerous people to the actual proven, documented targeting of Professor Anthony Hall, as well as more recently Jonathan Azaziah, the activist and rap artist who was recently pursued in authorities because his lyrics and his music is considered as inciting hate speech against Jews. So we've got this contrast where these people on this ADL list are all really getting a lot of attention, a lot of publicity within their ranks, as well as being publicly promoted as the faces of what represents and what stands for dangerous activism in the eyes of the public, whereas people who have actually been targeted and actually where there's documented targeting of them, they're not getting any sort of as dangerous as they supposedly are. They're being just attacked and persecuted pretty much behind the scenes, and there's no public knowledge of it. It's been very much just been swept under the rug. Whereas in another, you've come up with this contrast before too, and I'd like you to explain this. But whereas the ADL has actually put out the list, it's actually the B'nai B'rith that has come down on people like Hall and Azaziah. What do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, yes, and the ADL is actually, I believe, it's a subsidiary of some sort of the B'nai B'rith, and it's been the B'nai B'rith.
I think the full name is the I believe the full name is the Anti Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. So
yeah, and it's been the B'nai B'rith in Canada that targeted Professor Hall. Then targeted Kevin Barrett when he was going to the Al-Quds Day up in Canada to the B'nai B'rith, used their language, right, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, Holocaust denier, and called on the Border Patrol in Canada to not let Kevin Barrett in. And
that includes Breitbart for all you Trump people out there.
Right, and Breitbart did write a follow-up article on Barrett. And then more recently, the Jonathan Azaziah targeting by Canadian B'nai B'rith. And in that case, it wasn't Breitbart, but it was who was the woman who wrote the article?
Oh, Pamela Geller.
Oh, Pamela Geller.
That's the only. I think that's about the only person who wrote anything about it outside of like local media in Canada.
So it's pretty interesting that the networks that are increasingly close to the InfoWars crowd are the ones out of which not only that they're actually piling on in relationship to B'nai B'rith's attack on people like Kevin and Jonathan and Tony. And you're right, there's a very little talk in large swaths of the alternative media about this targeting by the B'nai B'rith. So, and then you have this ADL list that I imagine has a lot of different psychological warfare or psychographical warfare type of incentives or motivations for putting this list out. And it is interesting that the list is almost completely of Trump supporters. Some of them are like alt-right and who focus on Jewish power, and then some are focused more on globalists, would they maybe be called the alt-Lite. But I think what's interesting in this, and whether this is part of the larger scale psycho-warfare, psychographical motivation of this kind of list, is that there's what unites the list, I would say, is that the emphasis is on culture, on political culture as the root, and ethnic culture in some ways, even if it's more like dog whistled in the alt-right. There is this idea of the white Western civilization as the supreme entity by even the alt-right. And so I think this is very much related to what was conceived of as weaponized anthropology that people like Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill have done a lot of analysis and research about unpacking what all of that was. And what's interesting is that the idea of weaponized anthropology went back to before the ascent of the CIA after World War II. But it was people who were eventually involved in that, who were part of that move before the CIA even existed. And what Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill have unpacked is that part of what was being done was this idea of taking up indigenous cultures in targeted countries specifically. So you could think of places maybe like Indonesia, or the Philippines, or that type of scenario, and bringing in the indigenous cultures into the Western power institutions, intelligence institutions, and then feeding them back out to these nations and their peoples as a package deal, basically, to reinvigorate a focus on cultural identity and the productions of cultural identity. And it looks like the reason that this was done was to create a situation, first of all, where people would focus, as there was growing awareness economically and politically of the still ongoing colonialism in the so-called post-colonial era, that there was a way of moving that resistance, that rising resistance, into identitarianism, into cultural identitarianism, rather than a political unification for political dignity and sovereignty against foreign entities and foreign usurpers. That's one part of it. Another part of it, I believe, it looks like it has to do with a false unification or the creation of a caste, an identifiable political caste that could then be put in underneath a higher caste. And of course, this is the way that the empires throughout history have done things. And most directly, the British Empire has had a long history of the creation of counter gangs and of also of putting in their own proxies, political proxies that are basically closer to the empire and get the privilege and the benefits of being a functionary of the empire, while the masses are in a lower caste level. So I believe that this is at play in this whole scenario of the focus on identitarian politics, both left and right, and both alt-light and alt-right. So you see, I think also that you see the focusing of these people and trying to lump them together, alt-light and alt-right, not only creates some division, some exploitable division that can be used to further create conquerable rancor in elements of the right, but it also is a further tying up of what looks to have been the rise of this right-wing identitarian politics that was key to this Trump era. And in many ways, I see it as a response, as a reaction of Zionist game theory warfare to the rise of things like pro-peace libertarian politics, most readily seen in the Ron Paul movement. And you see that the Ron Paul movement was a threat to the right-wing establishment, the Republican establishment. I pointed out before the indicators that show that in the Republican primary of 2012, you can actually see some of the characteristics of machine fraud, election fraud going on in relationship to going against Ron Paul and towards Mitt Romney. So I do think that this is a reaction to this. And of course, there were also aspects of the Ron Paul movement that were a limited hangout, that were part and parcel of directing the Tea Party movement. Actually began with 9/11 Truth in Boston, and a response to the police state and the throwing of the Patriot Act and the Military Commissions Act and the 9/11 Commission report into Boston Harbor. It then got picked up and brought into the Liberty Movement and the Ron Paul movement, most intensely in Texas, and the role of Alex Jones and all of that. And then from there, it was then siphoned up into basically a Republican Party, so-called grassroots or AstroTurf type of organization, ultimately. So this is part of this, I believe, is that as there was a growth of the clear principled politics of the aspects of the Ron Paul movement that had to do with peace, with a peaceful foreign policy, but also a financial and economic sovereignty of a nationalist approach to economics, that no matter how much is talked about that the Trump movement is a nationalist in an economic fashion, like Bannon, what you see is there's almost no talk about the Federal Reserve anymore. It's all about depositing, giving tax breaks and goodies to a certain milieu of American oligarchs, which of course are still tied into these transnational networks increasingly seen to run through an axis that goes from Tel Aviv to Moscow. So I think that this is part of that. This list in many ways represents not only a way to continue on with the left-right divide and conquer that's been escalated in the Trump era, but to further emphasize the best way to get someone to protect their identity is to attack their identity, of course. And so this basically sets up a situation to further encourage identitarian politics on the right that can then be perfectly pushed off identitarian politics on the left. And I think we'll be looking at some of how that works later on.
Yeah, absolutely. That fantastic job just bringing all of this together, and the points you make about the similarities between this and the Ron Paul movement, which I think was co-opted in a lot of ways. And I don't want to talk too long about this because we have other topics to get into, but I wanted to make the point that when the Ron Paul movement, there was definitely a tension or a split, you could say, between those who were willing to get into topics such as false flag terrorism, September 11th, and I remember Jack Hunter was one of the primary staffers for Ron Paul. I think he's also involved with Rand Paul. He's since come out and condemned the alt-right. He is this video of him refusing to talk about the Bilderberg group, pretty much him saying anybody who brings that stuff into this is discrediting us and making us look crazy. And so there was always that, but I think where the difference is now with this inability to talk about false flags within that movement, and honestly within the higher ranks of any of those, and false flag discussion was never a significant topic within the Ron Paul campaigns. But the difference now, I think, where the similarity is that all of these people on this list have something in common. In addition to all having these common threads where they're connected to these organizations, most of the people on the alt-right section of the ADL list is either has connected to Richard Spencer's alt-right website, or is connected to a website called The Right Stuff, which is run by a guy named Mike Enoch, who has publicly stated that conversation of anybody who thinks Israel was involved in the September 11th attacks is crazy. So on a much wider scale than what we had with the Ron Paul movement, I don't think any of the people on this list have really adequately or honestly addressed the topics of false flags and the real elements of how the deep state seems to really work, as opposed to just using it as a generic term to describe anyone who opposes Donald Trump and his presidency. And another big difference is that this is actually reaching into the alternative conspiracy-oriented media, where you've got a guy like Mike Cernovich, who was a key player at InfoWars and who has never gone on the record about these type of events like a September 11th. But of course, he made his name for himself by conveniently promoting something which did help the political establishment, or the Trump era, the Trump brand, and that was the idea of Hillary Clinton being deathly ill, and also the whole Pizzagate, which did benefit Trump, regardless of how much truth there may be to individual elements of it, as we've documented. So it's even worse now in that the people on this list seem to be they're all have these common connections to organizations and entities that we've described, I think, as being controlled in large part, and also where they will not talk about the real nature of false flag terrorism. And now it's worse because the brands and outlets like InfoWars are actively collaborating with elements of these anti-false flag conspirators who are not willing to delve into this information, that are named on this list as being representative of the new political movement in this country and in the West. So that's really interesting. I'm glad you tied all that together, and I thank you for the commentary you gave on that.
Yes, Greg, and just last thing, I think you're completely right on in terms of the assessment that what holds a lot of this list together in many ways, and I'm sure there's a few exceptions on it, is the almost complete lack of focus, at the very least, or even incidents where you can identify that any of these people have credibly spoken about September 11th or the nature of the war on terror subsequent to September 11th, or the idea of false flag operations. And so that's one part of that, and it is interesting how that seems to be a unifying factor here, even across alt-light to alt-right, like you've pointed out in terms of Mike Enoch to Cernovich. And so that, I think that's key, because what it points out is that what's necessarily being limited here is a deep political analysis, and it's being deposited into the second aspect that I think ties this together, is that it has to do with depositing deep political analysis, which is very clearly beyond the left-right paradigm, as Alex Jones might have once said. That it turns the ADL in some ways into a leftist organization. This is the liberals that are attacking the grassroots right wing, and of course, what's missing in all of this, even though a lot of these people who are identified as alt-right are all over the Jewish question and focused on Jewish power, a lot of them, and use,
unless it comes to Donald Trump and his actual background.
Right. And so then it becomes, what's missed in all of this is that the ADL, in a large extent, operates as a domestic cultural hand of Zionist power. And that it really is the Defamation League, as we've pointed out. But it's not about defaming the right or the white. Yes, that may be part of what actually happens, of course. But even think about what the ADL was doing when there was the escalation of the bomb threats against the Jewish community centers. They were using that to push for linking up anti-boycott divestment sanction, BDS speech, to hate speech. And that was on the agenda. And then, of course, we found out that whole slew of threats pretty much was coming straight out of Israel. And we still don't know the nature of how tied in that operation from southern Israel was into actual Israeli intelligence operations. Has the Anti Defamation League retracted their remarks based on all of that? I don't think so. And in fact, what we're going to be talking about next, I believe, shows that they're doubling down on that. So that's missed in all of this.
That's a great tie-in to the next topic, and the next topic is this bill that's going through both sessions both chambers of Congress that will make it a federal crime to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And of course, we've seen this implemented on a state level, and there have been politicians who have talked about what they'll do to crack down on BDS. I know Hillary Clinton made that a major part of her campaign as far as Israel went, but I don't know if this is the first bill on a national level that's really targeting BDS, because I know there's been a number of bills on a state level, including from supposed progressives throughout the country and on a state level. But this is one I've seen on a national level, and once again, this shows that in all the fear-mongering Russia and what Trump may or may not know about Russia, it seems that all of these politicians, these political figures, whether they side with Donald Trump or whether they're opposed to him, one area where they all can seem to come together is on the topic of poor little Israel and how it's so evil for these people to speak out on behalf of the oppressed population of Israel. And they all seem to have a lockstep agreement on that. And plus, there's a lot of money that goes into their campaign coffers that probably directly influences that. But this really is where what you said just now is like where the real nexus of power comes together. And that is on the topic of Zionism in Israel and in some ways organized Jewish power. And what a couple of the names on this list that I believe are helping to sponsor the House bill are Peter Schiff and Ted Lieu. And these two, I think, are two of the members of Congress that have been most associated, publicly outspoken against Trump and his alleged Russia connections. It's really interesting to see the likes of Schiff and Ted Lieu come in lockstep with the most extreme elements of the Islamophobic, pro-clash of civilizations elements within the Trump administration they claim to deride so much. They're pretty much working hand in glove together on this matter. Find that really interesting.
Yes, and this is a key moment, I think, politically around this bill it's been in the works for a while now, and this article that really brought it to national attention out of The Intercept with Glenn Greenwald and Ryan Grimm points out that this was a stated goal, I believe, for AIPAC for this year was this bill. And it's not yet clear to me. There's a difference in the House proposal and the Senate proposal, and what it actually means in terms of criminalizing the support of BDS. And I think they're different in certain cases, and whether it actually has to do with an individual or with an organization. But it's clear that there are large swaths of the U.S. Congress, both chambers, that will just basically do whatever AIPAC tells them to do,
or to a lesser extent J Street, but mainly AIPAC.
Yes, and what's interesting in this in a Mondoweiss article about the Intercept article and the bill as a whole is it talks about something about the shockwaves. Bill making it a federal crime to support BDS sends shockwaves through the progressive community. And in this article, Phil Weiss points out that what's really moving here, and he specifically points out that how it has to do with the Democrats, that Jewish power and Jewish money is at the core of moving large portions of the Democratic establishment in relationship to these bills, where it includes like people like Ron Wyden of Oregon, who's seen as some kind of civil rights, civil libertarian kind of guy. He's one of the main guys speaking out against the warrantless wiretaps of the NSA. And yet when you have something that's even more core than something like the anti-constitutional behavior of the surveillance state, that you can actually speak out, that you can take political positions and not suffer legal consequences from your core political positions, people like Ron Wyden are just sort of signing off on this. So this does show the power of Jewish money and of the Jewish Zionist power networks that operate way beyond party lines. And so I think that's key. And what's also key about this is that the ACLU has weighed in there on the side of speech, which is a good sign in many ways, because the ACLU is a large part been highly controlled entity in relationship to the post 9/11 era. And some of that you can actually trace back to Morton Halperin in the 70s and 80s, his relationship with George H.W. Bush, and certain trade-offs that took place. I believe there's a book called Secrets, I think it's called, by Angus McKenzie, that deals with some of that aspect. So the ACLU weighing in on the side of speech, to me, is a good sign, and that this is sort of waking up some of the gone-to-sleep progressives that have been unwilling to deal with the hard facts of Jewish Zionist power in the United States of America. And so maybe this is an opening for a moment where we can begin to talk about this. Because Phil Weiss in this article also points out that such places as the Loeb blog, which I believe is talking about Jim Loeb, right, the critic of neoconservatism.
Yes, that's correct.
Who's someone that Robbie Martin, with his film Very Heavy Agenda, leaned on heavily in terms of his analysis of the neoconservatives and a de-Zionizing or a Judaizing of the neocon makeup, identity, political impulse. And so that Phil Weiss in this article said that The efforts by many to claim that the Israel lobby is also evangelical Christians, lately Paul Pillar at Loblog, is pure deception when it comes to the Democratic Party. Evangelical Christians don't tell Schumer and Gillibrand how to vote on stem cell research or abortion, and they don't tell them how to vote on Israel either. No, the organized Jewish community does. And so this is a key moment right now for especially for the progressives. I think that Phil Weiss is pointing out that this has been a very difficult situation for progressives to talk about. And there's been, and of course this fits back into what we were just talking about the politicization of deep politics, where it's all about those, the left is fed the line of that the Israel lobby is largely driven by evangelical Christian Zionists and fail to deal with why are people like Adam Schiff, Ted Lieu,
people like Chris Hedges are really indicative of that line of thinking.
Yes, that's true. So I think if we can use this moment to go deeper into this and begin to actually look at what's being done in a very physical fashion, so that involves dealing with September 11th, which is stuff that people like Phil Weiss are very tiptoe around at the very most. But also dealing with the underlying factor that ties back into Israeli military intelligence, Talpiot, that Brendan O'Connell has highlighted, that we begin to need to talk about this hardware-software layer that's undergirding a lot of these political moves in a way. Because think about what that actually might mean is that a forcing of people not to be able to toe a BDS line may have something to do with things like technology transfer relationships, security contracting relationships with firms that tie directly back into Israeli military intelligence. And with the escalation of stories about body cams in terms of relationship to recent police shootings, and the now acknowledgement that the body cams are the next step with the body cameras is for facial recognition software. And as we've already pointed out and talked about in relationship to this Kansas City Public Library arrest, the Jewish federations of North America have already set up a contracting relationship for in-motion identification software, biometric software, with a firm straight out of the heart of Israeli military intelligence, with the software originally founded by a former head of Israeli military intelligence and a credibly accused 9/11 suspect such as Ehud Barak, also a former head of Israeli military intelligence, on the board. That's called FST Biometrics. So this, I believe, and I think Brendan O'Connell has made some important points, that what's missing in the boycott divestment sanctions movement is this high technology aspect. And yes, okay, SodaStream, things that give bubbles to your soda, or certain kinds of citrus that might have been grown in the West Bank, maybe that. Yes, that's part and parcel, or aspects of the contention over some of the cultural boycotts, or where plays that are being funded partially by the U.S. government, or academics that are tied in, by the Israeli government, or academics that are tied back into the Israeli government are being increasingly boycotted by Western civil society, including in the United States. But the key part that's missing here is the national security aspect, the national interest aspect of this. Yes, it's very clear that this is at least as clear an ethical choice as the divestment movement was in relationship to apartheid South Africa. In many ways, Israel has steps to take in order to get to at least an apartheid status, especially in relationship to its acknowledged slow genocide approach to Palestinians who are just sort of unincorporated subjects of an ongoing colonization and occupation. So, but the key part that ties back into our national interest is not just our ethical commitment to the Palestinian people, but also that, especially since September 11th, but before that, there's been an escalation of the dependence of our society and our government and our industrial backbones on Israeli hardware and software that comes straight out of a Talpiot program that was not only about creating innovation in Israeli technology for their own sake in terms of their own military position, but also in terms of an intelligence long-term mission where it was a software approach, a software parallel approach to the Samson option, where, as was shown, that Israel had nuclear weapons pointed at capitals in Europe, and that if they were ever under political or physical threat in any way, that they would be willing to take down Europe with them, the Samson option. There's also a Talpiot option here, where more and more the software that the industrialized world is dependent upon has been increasingly Israelified. And this probably would not be as big a deal if this were not a long-term garrison state, or that this obviously comes out in some way from this Talpiot program that evolved after the Yom Kippur War, and that actually sends entrepreneurs out, Israeli entrepreneurs out, into the wider high technology world to occupy key positions for in both in business and in politics. And so, whether you're looking at the role of something like all of the telecommunications software such as Amdocs, it's now, we just found an article that shows that Amdocs was a key contractor during the White House renovations or updating of the phone systems during the Clinton years. So did Amdocs play a key role in the Monica Lewinsky blackmail side of the operation coming out of the Israeli embassy in D.C. that pointed to this Mega, the codename Mega, which was put forth as a potential individual mole in the White House. Other people have called it an actual program, maybe sort of relating back to Amdocs, a spyware telecommunications software. And but we've also found that there was actually a group of high-level multi-Jewish Zionist billionaires that were known as the Mega Group. And some of these people, such as Les Wexner, tie back into the Trump milieu. But that's something to put forth on another day. But just finishing up and thinking about the boycott divestment sanctions, and this is sort of a preemptive move, I think, by the Congress, being pushed largely by AIPAC, to try to preempt a really wise and strategic move to get boycott divestment sanction to focus on boycotting the outgrowth of the Talpiot program and of the Israelification, the military intelligence occupation by a foreign garrison power in our civilian infrastructure. This goes all the way to thinking about the incident of a Caltech professor who was doing some classified work in her laboratory, and there was an Israeli grad student that tied right back into aspects of this program. It looked like the Technion University goes back 100 years, I believe, in Israel, and it's the key locus of the development of the Israeli high technology sector, which of course is not only about innovation, but it's also about spying and taking technology out of the United States security apparatus and taking it into the Israeli security apparatus. And of course, aspects of the Jonathan Pollard spying case, all the way up to things like the Arnon Milchan nuclear triggers spying case, have to do also with what does Israel do with this technology after it's acquired it itself. It appears to be trucking and bartering in it, and passing it on to such alleged enemies of the United States as China and Russia. So this is part of this. People should go look at this Caltech spying case of this professor who's now been put under serious pressure. Whereas you think if we had a real national security counterintelligence apparatus, they would have gone and rooted all of this out. It's also apparent in quantum computing. Go look at who the director of the one of two major quantum computing centers in the United States, I believe, is one at USC. And it's a joint program between USC and Lockheed Martin. And the director of that program comes straight out of Israel and I believe the Technion, I think. But go check that out. So this is all going on here, and this is why this is not only seditious behavior that's going on in terms of all of these politicians, this bipartisan consensus of the people who are leading the attack on Trump based on the Russian situation. People like Adam Schiff, and Ted Lieu. These people are openly dealing with a foreign military power to try to suppress the core political speech of the American people that they're supposed to be protecting. So that's obvious. But then I think if you actually look very clearly at this and you see what September 11th was, and you see what the war on terror actually is, September 11th was in many ways a treasonous operation. It involved treasonous elements from within the United States in collaboration, largely and in a majority fashion, with a foreign military power that could be increasingly seen as not a friend or an ally, but as a nemesis or an enemy, at the very least, of things like the Bill of Rights, or even materially and physically of the American people and American soldiers, in order to get the United States to pursue the war against the Likud party's enemies abroad. So this I think should be looked at, this idea of a moment not only for especially the left and the progressives to begin to be comfortable to talk about the dark sides of Jewish power and the Zionist power configuration and the money that is used to politically capture our representatives, but also to go deeper to dealing with what was September 11th, how was it done, and more importantly, who did it and why, and then what is going on after this fact with the escalation of the Israelification of our civil society, which we see more and more, and even could have been a very key part of the Gazification of an American library back last May.
Yep. Yes. Thank you for tying that all together. And you mentioned, of course, the connection of all of this technological cybersecurity stuff going on. And with that, I think that with this topic of the cybersecurity and Talpiot and all that has to do with all of this high technology, I think that might be becoming one of the new fourth or fifth wheels of politics, where it's like, those are like what is really becoming one of those, I think in some ways becoming one of those litmus tests of whether people are willing to address this. And it is much like a topic of false flag terrorism, such as September 11th and other events. Does appear to be becoming one of those third rail type of topics. So it'd be interesting to see who will be willing to get into this and who won't be, because I think the implications of this are are very important, not just regarding the Israel relationship, but when the U.S. relationship with Israel, but also when you take into consideration a lot of the high technology that deals with Israel and Russia and the coming together and all of the deals that have been made there, that this could actually be a key to understanding what the actual, quote, Russia connection is to this past presidential election, too, possibly, if we really dig into the answers about that. So it's all very, very vitally important. And it is not the most interesting topic to look into or to research or study, but it is extremely important, and it is something that we should all be taking time to try to at least have a basic understanding of. And then people, of course, like a Brendan O'Connell can really tie the pieces together on that. But this is stuff that is important to look into, as it is much more important, I think, than we maybe realized in the past. And so,
yeah. And then one other thing about this is that I just found out, and I don't know how I missed this, but that the Technion University, in collaboration with Cornell, has been chosen by New York, most specifically Michael Bloomberg, to create a innovation campus in the middle of Manhattan as the way of leading New York economics into the future. So there you go. You have a university that clearly feeds a foreign military power now setting up shop in Manhattan. And just thinking back on the Left Forum and its relationship, its material relationship with John Jay College, and the head of its board being a certain Jules Kroll, and how key the actual, the material networks that tie together the Jewish Zionist New York scene, that ties into aspects of U.S. intelligence, but then also ties directly into a foreign powers of military intelligence apparatus and strategies. And that I would say that they are not good for the Jewish people, and they're definitely not good for the American people. And so I think it's
or any people for that matter.
For sure. And I guess, and this is sort of why that it's definitely not good for the Muslim people of the world, or the Palestinians, or, of course, that's right. And it's not even good for the Israeli people, because they're being maintained in a continual state of disruptive and destabilizing fear and psychological paranoia by a geostrategic plan of tension that elements of their government have fostered from way back. So yeah, and then I guess my perspective in terms of why I might talk about the Jewish community and the American community is because I've always been suspicious of the tendency by certain progressives to sort of like think about, oh, we're going to go help them over there, and even things such as like Sudan and the Darfur, and that looks like that the using of people's good hearts was a lot done for aspects of Israeli foreign policy, a militaristic foreign policy. And so I think that an enlightened self-interest is the proper approach to politics, not a sort of a small identitarian approach of sort of, retracting into your apparent racial community, but also not the progressive move to try to care about those people over there while your own country's core political institutions are being undermined in a seditious fashion by a foreign military power.
So true.
And it's not Russia.
Well, it could be elements of Russia. We don't know,
Russia.
But exactly. And it's not Russia that's leading the way either. But it's all about finding that radical middle, as you call it, Jeremy. So let's work together to come towards that. Last few minutes, I'd like to shift a little bit, but it's still on this same topic. It's related to all that we've talked about here. And I've been following a kind of I guess you call it a split, a bit of an argument within elements of the left, the hard left, that falls outside of the whole like establishment realm that we've talked about, and even in some cases falls outside of the generic BDS types. Anyway, there's been a split over. Australian blogger named Caitlin Johnstone wrote an article in which she's advocated an alliance with Mike Cernovich, which we have a problem with that for a number of reasons, and I'm sure the listeners can figure out why that's a problem. But anyway, in response to writing this article, Caitlin Johnstone was viciously criticized by a number of individuals, Benjamin Norton being one of them. Of course, I wrote an article about the Robbie Martin aspect to the criticism of Caitlin Johnstone, and there have been a few others that have come out. There's been pieces written on Counterpunch that have been criticizing not just Caitlin Johnstone, but also the Green Party for working with her and promoting her work. And in the process of this, while it does seem to be a generic criticism of someone who proclaims to be a progressive, aligning or advocating an allegiance with someone who the detractors have labeled and identified as being a fascist, an enabler of fascism, and a promoter of fascist-type policies and statements. You've identified an underlying potentially anti-conspiracy nature to this criticism of Johnstone and the idea of left and right coming together on these matters, although this is not the kind of left-right alliance that we would personally advocate for with Cernovich. Is there potentially another layer of this that goes beyond just a leftist having issues or anti-fascist types having an issue with a proclaimed progressive advocating an alliance with someone like Mike Cernovich? Is there more to it, do you think?
Yes, there's, in an interesting, maybe an ironic fashion, there's actually maybe a structural, some structural reason behind some of this attack on Caitlin Johnstone and the larger idea of trying to immunize or inoculate the aspects of the left from thinking about or working with in a pragmatic fashion people from other parts of the spectrum or different political backgrounds. And yes, okay, the whole question about Cernovich is a whole nother deal, whether that's the right and wise figure from the other side of the spectrum for Caitlin Johnstone to say she wants to collaborate with. That's another issue, maybe for another show. But this question about why is it that the key elements of the serious left, let's call them, some of them, in many ways they're controlled, but let's at least give them good faith that they're the serious left, that they believe in a structural analysis, and that's what they mean by talking about capitalism, and that capitalism is the reason or the source of all of these other problems, and that includes their explanation for things like racism, what they would call white supremacy, misogyny, these types of things. There's an argument, of course, on the left about that these types of things are not just an emanation, that they exist on their own terrain, but the serious structural leftists believe that it's all of that is an emanation of what they see as the negative aspects of global capitalism. So there has always been this idea of structuralism as the key thing to focus on, and that when you get caught up on either individual people or individual events that is seen as part of the analysis of so-called conspiracies, right, which is just a crime, a very specific crime that involves more than one people, then you get caught up in a boogeyman of sorts. And of course, there is some accuracy to that, especially we've seen as the amplification of the reactionary move by the InfoWars crowd that used to at least give lip service to beyond the left-right paradigm, the focus on the deep state and the police state and the worst aspects of the national security apparatus and the transnational elite, and has gone towards the focus on it's the left and the feminists and the Muslims and George Soros. And so you can see, okay, that type of so-called conspiratorial thinking does play a highly negative role, I would say. At the same time, there's once you have a national security apparatus that structuralizes conspiracy as a mode of political action, anyone who's trying to tell you not to deal with the de facto status of the national security apparatus as using conspiracy, the organization of criminal actions amongst many people, as a way that it advances its motives, its reasons, and it doesn't matter what your analysis of the negative side of the reasoning is, whether it's capitalism, globalism, Zionism, whatever way you might want, whatever ism you might want to associate with the negative side of the structuralized apparatus of conspiracy. What we see is that the way that is maintained, the power structure is maintained, is through a structuralism of conspiracy, of state crimes against democracy, as Lance DeHaven Smith has called it, or scam, state crimes against the mind, as we have termed it. So this needs to be dealt with. I think there's a very interesting interview in the recent weeks of Michael Tracy interviewing Peter Joseph from the Zeitgeist film series and movement on the Young Turks network. And a whole good 10-15 minutes in the very beginning is spent with Michael Tracy sort of pushing on Joseph to try to get him to say that it may have been his conspiratorial analysis in the first Zeitgeist film. One was sort of had to do, one part was about 9/11, one part was about the money system, and another part was about organized religion. And basically, I think Tracy was basically saying that Joseph was marginalized because he dealt with these types of conspiratorial analyses, and also then wanted Joseph to sort of cop to having set up the InfoWars crowd and the conspiracy theory crowd and made them more popular in a way by his previous work. And although Joseph held the line about September 11th and saying that, you know, that still needs to be dealt with, and there are lots of questions that hang out there, he was very readily browbeaten into a corner around things that needed to be analyzed about deep politics. So there is this aspect of the parts of maybe the cleansed left, where they will use a serious, even academic analysis of the structuralization of conspiracies such as false flag terrorism, disinformation, counterintelligence programs, and the weaponized money system as a way to bludgeon, to beat their people into submission. That includes the relationship between people like Max Blumenthal and the Martins, but also then is now in play, I believe, with this Johnstone situation, where she's being attacked in a serious fashion by elements writing out of Counterpunch. And I guess we're in our last minute here, so if you want to make any final comments, Greg, go for it.
No, you're exactly right, and it's so important to just ignore these. It's important to have it's okay to have an ideology. It's okay to see the world a certain way. It's okay to have to to see the world a certain way. It's okay to subscribe to a specific worldview or a specific philosophy or ideology. And I don't think that I really am against the idea of just lumping people and judging them based on their personal ideological beliefs. But it is important to be able to look past those and look at realities that do exist that all of us can acknowledge, regardless of what we may personally believe. And it's important to not have such an overriding purity when it comes to ideology or people you may disagree with.
Very much
that
agreed.
Can keep you from.
And we're out of time, but I agree with you. Yes, ideology and identity is a part and parcel of our being, but we must emphasize principle and political pragmatism over that. Antidote out. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.